The waitress did not notice the shift at first, because for her the restaurant had always been a place where small storms gathered and passed every hour, the clatter of plates, the hiss of steam from the kitchen, the impatience in a customer's sigh. But something about the man at the corner table felt different now, heavier, like the air itself had paused to listen, and as she returned with his tea she felt an odd tightening in her chest, the kind that comes before a moment you can't undo. Because he was no longer looking at the menu or his phone or the window, he was looking at her with an attention so focused it almost felt like a spotlight, and when she set the cup down her hand trembled just slightly, enough for the spoon to tap the porcelain, a small sound that somehow echoed too loudly in her ears, and she apologized out of habit, bowing her head, and it was then, almost without thinking, almost by accident, that she murmured the apology in Japanese instead of English, a soft, reflexive phrase her grandmother used to say when correcting a child, the words slipping out like a secret she had never planned to reveal, and the effect was immediate and absolute, because the man froze, not metaphorically but physically, as if someone had pressed pause on him, his fingers hovering above the table, his breath caught halfway in, his eyes widening not with surprise but with recognition, the kind that reaches backward through time and pulls memories into the present, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the restaurant noise rushing back in around them while they remained in a bubble of stillness, until he spoke, quietly, carefully, in Japanese so precise and old-fashioned it sounded almost ceremonial, and asked her where she had learned to speak like that, and the waitress felt her heart begin to pound, because this was the moment she had always feared and half-hoped for, the moment when the language she carried like a private inheritance stepped into the light, and she answered honestly, explaining in halting phrases that her grandmother had been Japanese, that she had raised her for a few years when her parents worked double shifts, that the language had been bedtime stories and lullabies and scoldings and love all wrapped into one, and as she spoke she saw something soften in the man's face, the hard edges smoothing, the guarded expression loosening, and he gestured for her to sit, not as a command but as an invitation, and when she hesitated, glancing toward the manager's station, he smiled faintly and said something that made her blink, telling her in perfect, gentle Japanese that some conversations mattered more than rules, and she sat, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, unaware that across the room a few diners had begun to notice the unusual sight of a billionaire no one recognized leaning forward like a student before a teacher, listening intently to a waitress everyone else had overlooked, and as their conversation unfolded, it became clear that this was not just small talk but a meeting of two quiet histories, because he spoke of Tokyo streets before the towers rose, of factories rebuilt after war, of promises made to fathers who never lived to see their sons succeed, and she responded with stories of her grandmother's tiny apartment, the smell of rice steaming at dawn, the way certain words carried emotions English could never quite touch, and with every exchange the man's composure cracked a little more, until finally he admitted, voice low, almost vulnerable, that he had not heard his mother's dialect spoken that way since she died, that most people spoke to him now in numbers and contracts and praise that felt empty, and that her words had reached him in a place money could not access, and the waitress realized then that whatever this moment was, it was already bigger than a shared language, it was about being seen, about having one's inner world acknowledged without explanation, and as the manager finally approached, tension written across his face, ready to reprimand her for sitting with a customer, the billionaire looked up, switched effortlessly back to English, and said with calm authority that he had requested her presence, that she was providing exceptional service, and that he would like her to remain, and the manager faltered, nodding quickly, retreating with apologies, while the waitress sat there stunned, her ordinary shift transformed into something surreal, unaware that this single decision, this accidental sentence spoken in Japanese, was quietly setting in motion events that would ripple far beyond the walls of that restaurant, altering careers, fortunes, and lives in ways no one present could yet imagine, and if you're still here, still listening to this story unfold, remember to subscribe, because moments like this, where one overlooked voice changes everything, are exactly the stories we bring you, and the most powerful turns are still ahead. By the next morning, the restaurant felt smaller to her, as if the walls had shifted overnight, because the memory of the man's eyes, how they had listened more than they looked, refused to fade, and she told herself it had only been a conversation, a strange, emotional one, but nothing more, until a black car waited outside at the end of her shift and a sharply dressed assistant stepped out holding her name on a tablet, bowing politely and speaking to her in Japanese with the same respectful cadence she remembered from her grandmother's friends, and in that instant the weight of what had happened finally landed, because the billionaire she had spoken to was not just wealthy but legendary, a man whose companies quietly powered cities, whose face rarely appeared in media, whose presence was usually filtered through boardrooms and legal teams, and yet here he was extending an invitation, not to a job interview, not to charity, but to a conversation he had not finished. And as she rode in the car, watching the city slide past, she realized she was not being summoned for her service skills or her resume but for her voice, for the part of her that had been invisible until she spoke the right words at the right moment, and when they arrived at a private office overlooking the harbor, he was already there, not behind a desk but standing by the window like someone waiting for a familiar sound, and he greeted her in Japanese again, thanking her, not thanking her for kindness, but for honesty, and what followed was not an offer but a confession, as he explained how success had isolated him, how people mirrored back what they thought he wanted to hear, how even in his home country he had become a symbol rather than a person, and how hearing her speak had reminded him of a time when language was about connection rather than leverage, and he asked her about her dreams. A question so simple it startled her more than the luxury around them, because no one had ever asked it without an agenda, and she answered carefully at first, then more freely, admitting she wanted to study languages, to work in cultural exchange, to help people feel understood the way she had made him feel, and instead of smiling politely, he nodded as if confirming something he had already decided, explaining that his foundation funded international education programs that struggled not because of money but because of sincerity, and that he needed people who remembered why communication mattered. People who could bridge worlds without trying to conquer them, and when she hesitated, overwhelmed by the speed of it all, he said something that stayed with her forever, that opportunity often disguises itself as disruption, and that being overlooked is not the same as being unprepared.